Welcome to today's lecturette. I'm Dr. Leslie Jones, and today we're going to be taking a brief look at the ECEC sector as a whole. We're going to be examining the context for the sector development and the important influences that have led to where we are today, and then a really brief look and summation of the important directions and contemporary legislation that is influencing the way that the ECC sector operates in Australia, and of course the professional practice that supports that. In previous lecturettes, We've had a look at the impact of the meso and macro influences on practices that are more directly influencing the interactions, relationships and proximal processes that educators and teachers engage with. Today provides a capstone look at how the sector has developed in the last century to be the vibrant profession that we all aim to work in. As you begin your careers with children, families and communities, it is important to really understand how the sector has developed and, more importantly, your place within that history and its future. Your professional identity will be shaped by your own personal and professional values and beliefs and experiences, and also by the context in which you work, both at the local level but the broader sense of what it means to be part of the profession. I've spoken before about Riverland and the work that researcher has undertaken to assert that the early childhood community has developed its own discourses and rhetoric and practices and theoretical perspectives in order to facilitate professional communication and understanding between colleagues. And FLIR also suggests that the ECEC sector has developed its own code of practices, discourse and theoretical perspectives to help us understand the work that we do. And of course, that's all very true. But I wanted to make the point today that your practice will unfold in the real world of context, and the context in which you work has been shaped and significantly influenced by successive government policy, advocacy and political agendas. And understanding that influence is a really important part of understanding who you are and how you fit within the profession that you've chosen to work. I wanted us now to have a look at some of the major milestones along the evolution of the ECEC sector in Australia. So if we go right back to the beginning of where the sector first was formed, we know that the earliest provisions really relied on philanthropic support, so no government support for the provision of kindergarten and childcare. And these early providers had a well-established focus on providing childcare for children delivered by highly trained staff, which is incredibly interesting given the time frame in history that we're talking about. Kindergarten training colleges were established to support the provision of kindergarten services to young children, and there was this focus around kindergarten being delivered by trained professionals. And this arrangement was fairly long-standing, and the next major disruptor to the model of kindergarten provision and childcare in Australia didn't really occur until the 1970s. And in the 1970s, we see the introduction of the very first legislation specifically dedicated to the provision of childcare. And that came about because of some incredibly strong lobbying from the feminists and advocates of the day. And the discourse at that time was around the social justice aspect of universal access and high quality provision that was prosecuted by the feminists of the day. And from that point forward, really interestingly, childcare became an embedded feature of every successive federal government policy platform moving forward from that. If we then fast forward to the 1980s and into the early 1990s, the discourse on childcare was marked by the persistent tensions between childcare for social justice and for economic agendas. The strong advocacy changed at that point from the feminist movement and universal access movement to the advocacy persecuted by the trade unions throughout this time. And they really brought a focus around the provision of childcare for everyday workers in our community as part of their social wage agenda. This was a period of time where there was significant wage constraint, and this was a bargaining chip used by the unions of the day to try and get some benefits for workers who weren't going to get any monetary increases through wage provision. So this notion moved the discourse away from childcare for either disadvantaged families or for families who were quite affluent and can afford it, to access for the broader community and wage-earning families. But it's important to note that it was part of an employment agenda, and we can still see that echoed in public policy even today, that funding to support childcare still has a very strong emphasis on workforce participation, that had its genesis in the trade union advocacy of the 80s and 90s. Subsidies to support the cost of childcare went through a number of policy iterations but they began in the 1990s. But substantially, parents who were working or studying received more support than those who were not. So again, it met that notion around workforce participation that was such a strong underpinning philosophy for childcare legislation. If we move now forward into the 2000s, the next significant milestone for us to consider is that of the education revolution of the Rudd Labor government of 2007, who brought about some significant changes to the ECEC landscape. The focus through the education revolution was on the quality of service provision and was a cornerstone of early childhood policy for the Rudd government, and saw the introduction of the 2009 of the Early Years Reform Agenda. This agenda included the development and introduction of the National Quality Framework, and that's included the development and implementation of things that you're very well aware of, including things like the EYLF and the National Quality Standards, and the increased requirements for qualification levels of educators working in the sector. The reform agenda captured all service models, which was something that was new. So included community preschools and kindergartens, outside school hours care and family daycare models, as well as the long day care sector as well. If we think about the 1990s, there's one outstanding feature that was a changing part of the landscape for early childhood education and care in this country, and that was the establishment of long day care as a dominant player in the marketplace, with a huge expansion of the number of long day care services that began to be built and operated across the country. And we started to see the emergence of corporate childcare. And of course, ABC is probably the most well-known of the corporate models, both for its size, but then also eventually for its financial collapse. So it was a changing landscape that the sector was experiencing, and new opportunities for access and engagement for children and families was definitely being realised by the expansion of the long day care service into the sector. As the ECC sector expanded into the 1990s, it began to include private providers and the expansion of the long day care model. There was concerns overall from the sector about the quality of service provision in the long day care sector, and as a result, the first national accreditation system was developed to provide expectations of what quality needed to include, and assessment processes for every long day care centre to review their programs and service provision. This, of course, was the forerunner to today's national quality standards. The discourse over the quality of non-for-profit and community services versus private providers has mellowed in recent years, and there is absolutely recognition that this community debate can't be held as a binary position. So not all non-for-profit services are great, and not all for-profit services are bad. To take this type of binary position is unhelpful and also inaccurate. The gap between the quality of service provision between non-for-profit and profit continues to align and refine. And in recent years, many services in the for-profit environment have received exceeding ratings under the NQS. However, there is still some areas of concern in relation to wages, satisfaction from team members working in those services, and the quality remains definitely a focus for private sector and non-for-profit sector alike. We can't talk about the expansion of the long day care model in the Australian sector without bringing into sharp focus the changes to funding regimes over recent decades. Funding to support childcare has really negotiated a range of iterations and shifts in government policies from the 1970s. Originally provided as operational funding for services, where the funds were anchored into the centre itself to support the cost of operating the service, where childcare subsidies in the 1990s moved to be targeted to offset the cost of family fees, and so were tied directly to the child rather than the service. This shift was really notable and had a significant influence on how the sector operates and the financial viability of many childcare services, both community and privately owned alike. As an important backstory as to why that financial shift actually occurred in that manner, infrastructure investment that had been traditionally done from governments to build kindergartens and preschools actually changed. Economic rationalisation in the late 80s and 90s saw the development of government policies to reduce spending across many traditional government-funded agendas, and the shift of the responsibility for building community infrastructure began to move to an open market economy philosophy. And that means that private developers and business owners began to develop and build childcare centres rather than the government. This trend has continued even into today's environment, with the vast bulk of new centres being built and operated by private for-profit organisations. As part of the shift in policy approaches to funding childcare subsidies in the 1990s, fee subsidies were expanded to include the private for-profit providers for the very first time. Legislation for funding had been in place for a number of years, but it was predominantly allocated to community non-for-profit operators. Expanding access to include private owners was a bold move and, at the time, contentious. There were very strong concerns over the care of children moving into a commercial environment where business outcomes potentially competed with social imperatives. This philosophical divide was a divisive discourse, later fueled by the financial collapse of the ABC Learning empire, and it dominated the sector for decades and is still debated even today. However, the discourse is moderated somewhat as the sector matures. Beyond this discourse, the decision to provide fee subsidisation for families using private operators has generated a significant expansion in the ECEC sector and the overall volume of children accessing early learning programs. The private sector supports far more children and families than any other ECEC delivery model in this country, including kindergartens and preschools, family daycare and outside school hours care. And while the inclusion of the private sector into the ECEC funding envelope has been debated, there is no doubt that they have absolutely contributed to the better access to early learning programs and childcare for millions of children and families. And now, as we begin to look forward into what the future for the ECEC sector may hold, it's important to take a look at the most recent legislation and funding envelope that's relevant to the early years. And that, of course, is the introduction of the childcare subsidy. CCS replaces the previous two forms of subsidy in the childcare benefit and the childcare rebate. And CCS is broadly calculated on the income of the family and the level of work-related activities that the family undertakes. It basically equates to more work equals more CCS. There are three pillars to this new policy. One, it's means tested against family income. Secondly, the hours of care that are funded depend on the family's work activities. And work activities include actual working, looking for work, study, and travel between study and work and home. Fee subsidies use a general formula of an eligible hours and an eligible percentage of fee and a generic model of a fee cap rather than individual services' actual fee charging structure to generate an individual family subsidy. The overall level of funding under CCS has increased for the majority of families, which has been really well received outcome of the legislation and has effectively made childcare more affordable for many more families. However, the sector and advocates have had some really big concerns over some of the more regressive aspects of the activity test for families, which assesses the work-related activities of a family every fortnight and examines activities including how many hours they're working, if they're actively looking for work and how they validate that, and of course if they're studying. Parents must demonstrate a minimum of 8 hours of work-related activity per week each to be eligible for the CCS. Parents who cannot demonstrate this and earn above $65,000 in the year become completely ineligible for any fee subsidy under CCS. And families who are below this income threshold and do not meet the activity test have had their access to early learning programs reduced to 12 hours a week. This is a reduction from 24 hours subsidy under previous legislation. So many of our most vulnerable families were really going to be halving their amount of access under this new legislation. So this aspect of the legislation has very many advocates and researchers and educators concerned, as it is counterintuitive to the agenda for universal access for early learning programs for children to improve child outcomes. In previous lecturettes, we spoke about the duality of the ECEC sector. The CCS activity test debate has significantly highlighted the tension between the two agendas for workforce participation and early childhood education. Access to early learning programs and the overall affordability of childcare for many families has really definitely improved in recent years. Governments and communities are becoming far more aware of the importance of the first 5 years for children and the work that is undertaken with children in the early years to improve outcomes. Advocacy campaigns about the first 5 years, economic and social return on investments by government in the early years are becoming accepted truisms. And the advocacy for better conditions for educators and teachers working in the sector is influencing government and the public and employers alike to the necessary investments in people to realise the objectives of quality education and care for better outcomes for children. Yet for all this, Australia still lags far behind other developed countries. The OECD has consistently identified that quality and government investment into the early years in this country as in the bottom third of developed countries. So our focus on continuous improvement and advocacy for better funding, access and quality must continue. As you begin your careers in the sector, consider how will you add to this discourse and advocacy campaigns? How will you keep up to date with government policy beyond a compliance to mandated change? How and when will you use your professional voice to advocate for children and for families? Answering and responding to questions like this will become part of who you will become as an early childhood professional and help define how you will bring policy into practice. Thank you for spending time with me again today in this lecturette. I look forward to our next lecturette where we will take our examination of policy into practice a little bit further and examine the complex notion of quality in some detail.